Hello and welcome to the second video of 3 in a series on The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. So today, the central metaphor is that the mind is divided like a rider and an elephant, and the rider's job is to serve the elephant. So, kind of like we talked about last time, intuition comes first, strategic reasoning second. So the rider is on the elephant, but not so much, the rider in this case represents reasoning. So they're on the elephant, but aren't so much able to control it, but more like make justifications for where the elephant is going, wherever it goes. So first, this I feel like is a very kind of strong narrative section of the book. And so it really flows into one another really well. And Haidt starts off the section talking about his studies on weird morality, which, if you'll remember, is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic cultures. So like one of the main populations for that would be college students. Generally speaking, relative to other parts of the world. So United States college students compared to, say, someone living in poverty elsewhere. So he kind of talks about how, well, first off, that there is a difference between weird morality and non-weird morality. And specifically, he tries to point out that or support his claim that weird individuals see, you could say, distinct concepts rather than a holistic concept when they view the world and their environment. So one example, or one study that he mentioned to support that was that when you ask people to describe themselves and make I am statements, so I am blank, people in these weird cultures are more likely to say I am something having to do with myself as an object. So like you could say, so one of the examples was you could say happy, outgoing, interested in jazz. So those are all like very self-focused adjectives or descriptors. Whereas people in non-weird societies would say, I am a father, a mother, a brother, you could say psychologist, a graduate student. Those are more having to do with roles and relationships. The other example that he gives is something about the a line task, like a square line task. I'll read the actual study to you because it's a bit complicated. So he says on page 113 of the book, the differences run deep, even visual perception is affected. In what's known as the framed line task, you are shown a square with a line drawn inside it. You then turn the page and see an empty square that is large or smaller than the original square. Your task is to draw a line that is the same as the line you saw on the previous page, either in absolute terms, parentheses, same number of centimeters, ignore the new frame, in parentheses, or in relative terms, parentheses, same proportion relative to the frame, in parentheses. So Westerners, specifically weird individuals tend to, they tend to excel at the absolute task because they saw the line as an independent object in the first place and stored it separately in memory. East Asians, in contrast, outperform Americans at the relative task because they automatically perceived and remembered the relationship among the parts. So I'm not aware of either of these studies, but in Haidt's view, at least, these are sufficient support to make the claim that we kind of view things as holistic or not holistic, as being separate entities, more categorical. And from that, he infers that weird individuals are more, you could say, analytical as opposed to holistic in their thinking, in their view of the world, and therefore that's why they're also more monistic versus pluralistic in how they view morality. So monism being, of course, looking at a single value, a single principle, a single moral module that is primary, sufficiently primary to the point where everything that takes precedence over any other possible values, or even that there is only one fundamental value that from which every other moral value that we see in culture and in society stems from. Whereas non-weird cultures would view morality as being composed of varying and non-overlapping values. So one example he gives is like one of Confucius' books, the Tacitus, something like that, where Confucius, I believe, is basically just meditating on a bunch of different ideas and gives sort of, if you're familiar with Nietzsche's later work with Beyond Good and Evil and Human All Too Human, where it's just kind of like different, almost lines, sometimes paragraphs of just thoughts. My understanding is that the Confucius Tacitus is similar in that format, but he outlines very different moral values and ethics that aren't necessarily integratable. So that's more of a pluralistic viewpoint. And so he also then, after this, goes to viewing philosophy as a sort of groundwork for, or maybe you could say, a manifestation of these cultural differences in how we view morality as monistic or pluralistic. So he kind of, he gives this framework, or suggests this framework, forget who it was from, but it's basically a way to look at autism. So you could say that there, in this framework, there are two scales. One is empathizing, which I'll demarcate as E, and one is systematizing. So empathizing, of course, is more of like emotional connection with other people, ability to recognize other people's emotions. Systematizing is how organized you desire things to be. So like your environment, how much synthesizing you seek in the processes you work through in daily life. So in this framework, if you are a very high synthesizer, if you are a very high systematizer and very low empathizer, so you could say that would be, if this is high systematizing and this is low empathizing, you would be right up here in this little box. Haidt's claim is that philosophers who tend to historically suggest, especially Western philosophers who suggest a monistic moral module, moral framework, are generally in this this kind of autism zone of this empathizing, systematizing framework. Specifically, he cites probably the most important figures of the two most prominent ethical frameworks that are popular today, that being deontology, which Immanuel Kant is the leading figure for, and consequentialism, especially utilitarianism, which Jeremy Bentham is sort of the figurehead for. And Haidt's claims that both either fit into that autism spectrum, where there are really high systematizers and really low empathizers, or are very close to fitting in within that. I think in his view, Bentham, based on historical works or like biographical reports about Bentham was very low empathy and very high systematizing, so he's like at the corner. But Kant was low empathy but not quite as systematizing. Or maybe he was up here. One of those. Basically, he was close. And so he suggests that because Kant and Bentham were very low, were in this autism spectrum, they were more prone to monistic thinking, but he contrasts them with David Hume, who is more pluralistic, speaks more on moral sentiments and such. He wasn't necessarily placed within this framework, but he is not a pluralist and not quite as low on empathizing, systematizing as the other two. And so we can kind of see within even the traditional Western philosophy, we can see that we can take on pluralistic or monistic viewpoints, supposedly based on this framework. And so Haidt says, based on his research, that moral pluralism is descriptively true. And we'll talk about this later when we start talking about moral foundations theory, but his kind of anthropological work, his work thus far that we've talked about in these videos, seems to suggest that in non-weird cultures, these individuals value pluralistic frameworks. And so because of that, there are values that aren't necessarily overlapping, that are, you could say, acceptable values within a moral framework. And so that it has to be true that people do hold different values that don't necessarily overlap or necessarily reduce down to a single principle. Obviously, because it's descriptively true, that doesn't make it normatively true. That doesn't mean that these pluralistic frameworks are what we ought to abide by, only that they're descriptively true and are held by a large amount of people. So there's that descriptive normative difference. And so he does say that moral domains vary across cultures. Obviously Western or weird cultures, they tend to be narrower and closer to monistic, and other non-weird cultures, maybe Eastern cultures, they tend to be more pluralistic. So he goes on to talk about what is probably you could say the critical piece of the book is moral foundations theory. He and his colleagues, maybe you could say especially Jesse Graham, who was a graduate student learning under Jonathan Haidt at the time at the University of Virginia when they were when Haidt was working on this project. They came up with a sort of, Dr. Graham now, came up with a survey to kind of explore the moral foundations that Jonathan Haidt had kind of come up with out of his research. And then they expanded on that survey and specifically measured people based on 5 scales. Those being care/harm, fairness/creativity/cheating, loyalty/betrayal, authority slash subversion, and sanctity slash degradation. So we'll take them in turn. Care and harm is kind of care and fairness really is what Haidt sees people as fundamentally. In weird societies, that's how we view morality, is that things are based on care and fairness. So care being more of, like, you could say, utilitarian pleasure principle, where we don't want to hurt people, we want to be compassionate towards people. Fairness is that people should get what they work for, and not cheat this system. So a good example of this, we could explain this through an example, is that, like, a lot of liberal or progressive individuals view billionaires as immoral people because they have so much money and other people don't have as much. So that is both care and harm. Care because homeless people or poor people who don't have money are suffering because of that, and so progressive people and of course others, but specifically within the progressive argument, they want to help those people, and because there is that kind of difference in the amount of wealth that individuals have, they think that, and also there is suffering on the part of the poor people, that we should close that gap and have a more fair system. Loyalty and betrayal is all about loyalty to groups, not betraying groups. And authority and sanctity are also very similar in their description. I would say that, and we'll see how this manifests in politics later, but care and fairness foundations are pretty similar, and loyalty, authority, and sanctity are pretty similar, and they do manifest as such. So authority is all about respect for leaders, for tradition, that kind of thing. And then sanctity, or like fathers, for example, in a traditional family. And sanctity degradation is about we have these different objects, or you could say objects, different traditions, rituals that we hold sacred, such as the United States flag, and we should respect those, and disrespect towards those objects of sanctity are those are immoral behaviors. And so we can kind of see with all of these, they aren't explicitly related to harm exactly. They're more like cultural norms in Haidt's view. And at the very end, I have number 6, and I've circled it because it's not obvious or decided yet whether or not liberty/oppression is a valid module within this theory, because when Haidt and his colleagues were going through these studies, he got feedback from, of course, both progressives and conservatives in the United States political system. And conservatives, I think especially, were angered by the way that they were perceived within the fairness, or the, the fairness, within the loyalty section. One of those, maybe fairness, but so basically they thought, no, this isn't how we actually are. What we really care about is of certain fairness for. So there was conflict between conservatives and progressives on how they viewed fairness as a construct. And so obviously conservatives thought that, in fact, progressives don't care about fairness because they're lazy and such. And progressives thought conservatives don't care about fairness because they are willing to allow or even promote differences in income and stuff like that. So what Haidt did is suggested a new module, that being liberty and oppression, that better captures the progressive argument. And so within this now, conservatives fit more with fairness because that's now conceptualized as how much work you put in to the group, whereas liberty and oppression is the sort of equity, you could say, framework of morality, in which it's all about the consequences of or the outcomes of behaviors. So like, for example, with taxation and wealth inequality, whereas fairness and cheating would be more about the means that you get those outcomes, which is more deontological, which is interesting because, as we'll see, conservatives generally fit the deontological, or excuse me, the, well, I'm relating it to moral tribes now kind of awkwardly, but so we have those 6 foundations. Liberty and oppression isn't such a widely used module within the moral foundations literature. It's not as often cited within the framework for other researchers' purposes, but it does seem to be probably the second most important concept for progressives as Haidt sees it. And so now we'll talk about the political correlates. So basically what Haidt found is that progressives tend to be more monistic in their view of morality. So they, number 1, care about care and harm. Number 2, care about liberty and oppression. Number 3, care about fairness and cheating. All fairly similarly strong, but especially care and harm, and the other 2 less so. And then the loyalty, authority, and sanctity foundations, much less so. Whereas conservatives tend to view them all very equally, relatively equally at least. So you could, a graph of it would look something like this. So you could say this is very left in the political spectrum, this is very right. And so we could say this is care and harm. Care for the left, as you move towards the right, drops towards kind of a middle area. We'll call this high, medium, low, just for illustrative purposes. So care and harm goes down, but is about middle, a medium amount for right-wing individuals. For fairness and cheating, it's more like right here, fairly high still, but still goes down, and then kind of intersects, and it's actually maybe a little bit more important for right-wingers. For loyalty and betrayal, it's pretty low, but it goes up to more of a middle area, then maybe a little bit higher for both of the first 2 foundations at the right edge. And basically the same for authority and sanctity. Those 3 are all pretty similar. And then for liberty and oppression, it's very high for liberals, but much lower for right-wingers. So you can see they kind of flip in a way, not super drastically, but certainly they all kind of converge as you move towards the right on the political spectrum. So that kind of sets up some of the conflict that we'll talk about next video between progressives, conservatives, and libertarians in this case are viewed within the progressive side. But next video we'll talk about the kind of political conflicts that are caused by these moral modules that vary from different cultures and different political attitudes, and talk about kind of how to make those conflicts go away, you could say. So I'll talk to you next time, and thank you very much.